Want ad space on the Her Podcast? Email itsherpod@gmail.com.
I'm Megan.
I'm CJ.
And I'm Erica.
And this is the Her Podcast.
Today we're so excited to be sitting down with Ashley Breland. Ashley is a clinical social worker specializing in boundaries, people-pleasing, trauma, and grief, and she uses her social media to focus on the topic of boundaries. You can imagine we all just leaned in a little bit closer when she was speaking. We're chatting about all things boundaries, all things, you guys. How to set them, how to hold them, and how to accept and support others' boundaries. This conversation is so good. We cover what boundaries look and feel like, how and when to set them. Spoiler, you are setting them all day, every day, without even realizing it. Yes, this was a bit of an aha moment for us as well. The difference between loud and quiet boundaries, again, another tip I would have never known, and how to set and keep boundaries with yourself and others. We talk about how boundary work is trauma work, overcoming people pleasing, how to say no to find your yes, and even sometimes how to say yes instead of no. What boundaries Ashley herself is working on daily. There is so much goodness packed into this episode. Ash delivers a ton of hard-hitting information in such a gentle way and reminds us to lean into progress over perfection. Let's get that one on a sweater, hey? Grab a notebook and get ready to write down all the gems she has to share with us. It's so good.
You are very cool.
Oh, go ahead.
Who's the coolest member?
Erica.
Me, for sure.
Erica.
Who's the least humble? Me.
Erica. Who's the Aries? Erica. No. Usually, it should actually be the Leo in the room, but you wouldn't think that.
Who's got the anxious attachment style?
Me. Oh, okay, good. We can talk about that too.
Great. Yep.
Our community is thrilled that you are on the podcast.
Really?
Like,
Yes.
Oh, that's exciting.
thrilled. As are we, obviously.
Literally.
I think the first question I want to ask you is, did we do okay on our boundaries episode that we did on our own without any idea?
I think.
I mean, that was just our honest, I'm going to use air quotes, everyday ramblings.
It's conversation, right? I mean, that's all it is when you start it up and you start looking how different people define boundaries and how they've come up around to even thinking or naming it. I think you guys did great. Yeah, there's and the people listening now have, permission to be like, oh, well, they're talking about it. Maybe it's like that's something that I could talk about or something I could consider that I never actually really thought of, or the way they defined it or how they used it.
Well, and I think that's what I was sort of alluding to here at the beginning is I think we've actually come, I think we've all, I would say from my perspective, we've all taken a step forward in our boundaries since we recorded that boundaries episode. Wow. And I think that it has really clearly opened nowhere near perfection. Perfection is not a thing.
We go for progress here.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
Yes, exactly. But movement forward in all of our own personal lives, which has been great. And I think, like you said, it started a conversation of what could this look like for each of us and for our community. And I think that the conversation piece is really important. I would love to know, to kick us off, how you would define the word boundaries or,
Yeah, that's a good question. I get that all the time. There's a few things that it continually changes. And I think that's the beauty of being sort of, and I shared with you guys that I'm like an apprentice of boundaries, right? Yeah. Because it's always moving and shifting based on, your life. And so my favorite definition right now of boundaries for myself is anything that you intentionally put into place to protect your progress.
Ooh,
that's good.
Can you say that one more time?
Anything that you intentionally put into place to protect your progress.
Wow.
Yeah.
I love that because it actually also allows for room to shift your boundaries around depending on what's working and what isn't working. And I think a misconception in setting a boundary is that okay, I've set this boundary, now I got to stick to it.
Yeah.
And then just being stubborn in the fact that it's well, I said that this is the boundary, so this has to be the boundary. Can you speak to what it looks like to set a boundary and then step back and be okay, what's working, what isn't working, and allow it to shift?
I think you just set a boundary.
Okay, great.
It's not, and also one of the things I like to share with people is that boundaries are what am I okay with and what am I not okay with. And when we look at setting boundaries, knowing in that intentional place that today I'm doing the best I can for myself or my family, my work, whatever that looks like. Tomorrow, that might be different. And that's okay. It's not that I did anything wrong. It's that you're able to go back to that place and go, what worked for me and what didn't work for me? And how can I do things a little bit different?
And allowing yourself the grace.
Progress over perfection.
Yes. I love that.
Yeah.
Why did you get interested in boundaries?
It's like not this big romantic story. Well, like honestly, it's so funny. Good friend Lisa Gregg, right?
We love Lisa.
Right? Who doesn't?
Yeah.
She knew I always wanted to do my own private practice, and Instagram was really rolling. And I'm quite new to social media. I've only been on Facebook for a couple of years since my son was born, so about 4. And she's like, Ash, you got to do it. You got to get on. Share some of your knowledge. And I don't know what I wanted to share. So I signed up for the gram and, invested in an Instagram course and learned a ton and started just sharing some of the pieces that were interesting to me. And at the time, very humble beginnings. A couple hundred people were following my account. And I happened to just put something up about boundaries, not with any real intention of what this was going to look like. And people were coming back and they were like, yes to this. And I never thought about this. And boundaries are so hard for me. I want to be nice. How do I do this? I don't want to upset people. I want to learn to say no. I want us to learn to say yes. And so I remember sitting back and I was like, oh, they talk about this niche thing in the gram world. This is fascinating.
Yes.
And it was kind of an interesting intersection because looking at where I come from is I always call myself a recovering people pleaser. I'm a chronic yes person and somebody who's really, really learned to have a different relationship with scarcity. And so in that intersection of boundaries, I'm like, of course, this would be me. This makes so much sense.
Right.
And I just rolled with it. And then last year I decided I'm going to just call myself the boundary therapist. And it's sort of just taken a life of its own. And it's really fascinating to see the conversations that happen and people coming around and being like, I never thought about that. Or, I have people coming into my therapy room now where they're like, hey, Ash, I saw this post that you had made and, this is what I did with it. And I'm sitting back like, this is so cool.
Yeah.
Isn't it amazing how you can impact people through what you don't even know is impacting people, right? Like you can put up a social post and they may not be inside of your physical office, but yet you're still making progress for other people and, starting that conversation. I think that story is actually very romantic.
Oh, well, thank you.
That's great.
Yeah.
And I also think that because you spoke about something probably a lot of people needed at the time, and so many of us either know we need to set boundaries or are afraid of setting boundaries, trying to learn about boundaries. And the fact that you started talking about it and started, showing what you were doing with it at the same time, I'm not surprised of the amount of people that were like, hey, yes, let's talk about that. I said to somebody the other day, I never get more engagement on my social media or conversations more than when I talk about my anxiety. It's people just want to be understood and find that connection with other people. And it's just such a great place to be able to do that as a positive of social media.
And know that you're not the only one.
Yes.
Right? Like it's like, oh, I too have really struggled to say no. Yeah. I too have really struggled to say yes. Right? And it's okay. And going from that place and learning, like there's just endless possibility with that.
Yeah. Oh, I love that. And you touched on people pleasing as being a recovering people pleaser.
Yeah.
And I'm curious, how did that transition happen for you? What did that look like in your life and how was that really hard and something you identified? And then how have you come out of it? And what would you say to people who are in that space of feeling like, I have to please everyone around me?
Well, I always come from a place of boundaries are not hard for you because there's something wrong with you. Boundaries are hard for us because of what happened to us. The things that we have lived through, the things that we have witnessed, the things that we got and the things that we didn't get and everything in between and outside of that. So we're not inherently bad at boundaries because we're flawed. It's because of the things that have happened around us. And so we're products of that. And so people pleasing for a lot of women, for people that were socialized as female, were really from the get-go conditioned, martyred, celebrated for putting our worth in something outside of ourselves. And so that can be one lane of people pleasing, and then a lot of the conversations I have in my therapy room are more of what we would call like big T trauma, where individuals are coming through who really learn to adapt to their environment based on what they were living through to survive. And a lot of that can be people pleasing. And so coming from that place, allowing individuals to sort of get this idea that, hey, this isn't me. That's the problem. Some of these pieces have actually contributed, right? And so holding this idea that, I'm not going to go back and, it's not conducive for us to go back and blame, but just to come back and be like, okay, this made sense. I was the youngest of a conversation years ago I had with a client was like, I was the youngest of 7 kids. My parents did the best they could with what they had at the time. So holding that in one hand and also recognizing the reality of what they were coming through and people pleasing coming through to be seen, to be heard, right, was such a really powerful moment. So for me, understanding that I wasn't the problem, that my story contributed to my people pleasing, right? Yeah. And lots of therapy. Let's just be real. I'm an avid consumer of therapy, right? And really coming to know that, right. People pleasing is a product. It's not like a personality thing that you're born with. And so that first piece is a really, so for anybody listening, just really recognizing that and be able to sort of sit with that and feel that is a change in the trajectory in itself. If you were going to do anything, just even that recognition that I'm not the problem.
Awareness.
Is just enough to even just shift people immediately. And that's what happened to me. And now it's really important for me when I'm saying yes to everything, I know something's not right. My friends know something's not right. I'll often be like, Ash, I see you saying yes to things. What's going on?
Yeah. So I love how we, often people speak about, learning to say no. But you just touched on learning to say yes. Can you elaborate on the difference there?
Yeah, I think immediately boundaries are no. We think of boundaries, we think of the word no.
Yeah.
Right? How do I say no better? How do I say no faster? Which is fine.
Yeah. I just want to ask, would you say that learning to say no is one of the biggest topics that you discuss with patients?
Oh, learning to say yes, learning to say no for sure. But it actually organically will move into what does your yes look like?
Okay.
Because if we're not ever able to say no, what good is our yes?
Yeah. Amazing. Sorry. I just wanted to clarify that.
There's both in there, right?
Yeah.
So I think people will come in really and like, oh, Ashley, you talk about boundaries. Let's help me say no. Wait, what are you saying yes to?
Yeah.
Which is usually a lot of things.
Yeah.
Yes to this, yes to this, yes to this, based on, the story, the experiences, whatever. It could be a people pleasing, could be a scarcity piece, it could be whatever. And so if we can get into what you're saying yes with, we can make that no mean a lot more, which then in turn makes your yes so much more powerful. So much more powerful.
Yeah.
I read this book a few years ago and I don't remember who it was by, and it was really good, and it was called The Best Yes. And it talked about, when we get so caught up in saying yes to everything, our yeses become less valuable, and that we end up saying no probably to something that actually should have been our yes, because by the time we get to that point, we're too in it, we're too tired, and now we've given a no to, it's like, no, that's your best yes, that's where your best yes can be. And that, I'm not anywhere being like, I'm great at saying no, I'm not, but I do remember taking that away and understanding that saying no can lead to a better yes.
Yeah. And saying no unapologetically. Sometimes I think specifically as women, right? It's like, I'm sorry, I really can't do that. I'm sorry. It's like, if we actually look at the definition of sorry, it's like you've done something wrong, right? And so that's the mindset, is that when I say no, I'm doing something wrong.
I read I think it was a magazine article, so that tells you it was a little while ago, because those don't happen anymore. But I read an article about how often we say sorry, and that we're watering it down. And that when you say sorry all the time for things that you aren't actually sorry for, when you need to use that word and actually be sorry for something, it doesn't mean what it used to mean or what it should mean. And that kind of always stuck with me. So I'm very aware of when I say sorry, or if I'm saying it too much, I'm like, okay, I'm not, you're taking the value out of it, watering it down. But to go off of that, we had a listener question that's about saying no and people pleasing, and she said, I struggle saying no to helping as I feel I'm letting people down. So how do I overcome that, is what she was wanting to know. But it's, I think, a piece of people pleasing, but also maybe an anxiety piece of being worried of letting people down all the time. Or maybe I'm wrong. Maybe I'm
no, I think I think the anxiety is a is a response. The anxiety is the response to my worth is caught up in how much people like me, how much I'm doing for other people, what people are thinking, feeling about me. So the anxiety is actually a response. So that, that body feeling, that physiological feeling, that kind of like, if I say no, they're not going to like me, or I'm going to let them down. They're going to be so upset with me. It's going to be, how am I going to handle this discomfort? So this anxiety kicks up. Well, yeah, of course, because your nervous system's going, ooh, we've probably been here before. Somebody probably didn't see me or hear me supportively, and we don't want to go back there again. So your nervous system's doing what it needs to. So peeling back that layer, my first, my thought is, what happened where your worth is now externalized, where your worthiness is actually outside of you in somebody else. So if coming from a place of, I don't want to let somebody down, that means if I say no, if my no has so much power that it's going to come back at me and say I'm not worthy enough, or I'm not good enough. So I can't do that, because I can't allow that other person to think that of me. Because if I let them down, what does that say about me?
Right.
Where do I leave? Where am I at then?
Wow.
I'm
curious.
Question,
yeah. I think so. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. No.
I think anything you say is a great answer.
I know. I think we're just like soaking in your goodness, your wisdom. You've touched on how your upbringing, can sort of play into people pleasing, and even you've touched on scarcity mindset. So I'm curious what your upbringing looked like and what your story sort of is that brought you into this place of learning to people please.
Well, I wouldn't say learning to people please. I would say people pleasing is a response.
Ooh, okay.
It's a response, looking at it in that way. And so I am the oldest of 3 siblings, right? So naturally, with very hardworking parents, my mom was a young entrepreneur. My dad was a truck driver. And so, extremely hardworking parents, being the oldest of 3, I think you naturally move into like a mothering, nurturing role. And, as I grew up and things were happening, then you just adapt to your environment, right? And it probably wasn't until my early 20s where people pleasing as a title probably started to come through, and I'd be like, oh, that's very interesting. I always knew that I get like this visceral reaction if I was to disappoint somebody, just to connect with that listener's question. I get this visceral reaction around disappointing or rejection. And so really allowing myself through some really turbulent times in about my mid-20s to go and talk to a therapist and be like, ooh, what's this about? And then as you sit down and you start to we're like, I always say to my clients that come in my therapy, we're like Shrek says, we're onions, right? Yes. And so you just sort of peel back some of these layers of the onions. You're like, oh, that probably was a root there. Yeah. This probably contributed here. I did the best I could to adapt over here. This really makes sense. And so really allowing yourself to be like, oh, it's not me. And then me being active in some of the actions from there. So really understanding that me saying yes to everything and everybody is not helping them, and it certainly was not helping me. So really pulling some of that back. And by no means, again, progress over perfection. Am I perfect at this? My body will go into yes. When things are coming at me, right? But now I'm thinking I'm at a place where, well, I talk about this enough every day, so it should be front of mind, where it's like, no, Ash, it's really okay. And so I put on my stories up, think about a month ago, I had an opportunity to do a written piece and I couldn't make the deadline. I couldn't make it work. And I said, no, this isn't going to work. And I just sat there. I'm like, is this what this feels like? I just sat there. I'm like, holy crap. I just said no. And guess what? Like, I remember when the world's still spinning. Yeah. And they came back at me and were like, Ash, that's totally fine. What about this date? Looked at my calendar. Boom. It was perfect. The article came out. It was great.
I think there's something to say about when we say no to things, it allows for other opportunity, right? And we speak about that. But also just having that, like, Kate, you said, no, that doesn't work. They came back with another option. And I think sometimes we forget there's other options available. Let's just figure out what they are instead of saying, okay, yeah, they said that, I need to do that. Yes, when that's not serving you or the people.
That's right. I remember like just saying no, and I was like putting my hand like, oh my God, no. I just said no, and I'm sweating, and I'm like, oh, it's okay.
Yeah.
They came back and, and I think it's such a good thing to remember those wins. And so a lot of the times folks come into my therapy room and it's all problem-centered talk, right? And so part of my work and part of my job that I love is bringing out those storylines that get forgotten amongst the problem-centered talk, right? So, for me, one of those alternative stories is hey, you were able, tell me, if I was the therapist doing therapy to me, but tell me how that worked for you. How did you set that up? And bringing those extra storylines in can be really powerful because people are using boundaries every single day and they don't even know it. We just call it self-care, going to bed, eating, going pee when you need to when you're a mom. That's a boundary.
Holy, we've talked about that a couple times with different women who are mothers on the podcast, but it's true. Yeah. The simplest things.
I'm teaching or I'm facilitating a master class or somebody coming in and they want me to speak. One of my favorite examples I share about myself is when I was working at the university and my son was born, I went back to work and I was so excited to get home at the end of the day, right? And I'd be doing my thing. And I remember being so many days I had to just go to pee. I just had to pee. I'm no, I have to get home. He's been away from me all day. I'm a horrible mother. I need to just get home. And this extra 5 minutes is so important. And I remember one day thinking Ashley, you are worth more than just you just need to go pee. You're worthy of just going pee. So just take a hot second, go to the bathroom and then go home.
Yeah.
And then you don't have to do that when you go home because you need to be all over you when you're there.
Yeah.
And so I share that. And I remember having this one community I was speaking with. One of the feedback was the pee example was so amazing. I'm geez, I didn't think people really related to that.
I think all mothers
that's a boundary
relate.
Because in my mind, it wasn't okay for me to put off a basic need of just going to the washroom.
Yeah.
It wasn't okay for me. And then you just do it.
It humanizes us and you, right?
Yeah.
Just that simple connection of being this is what's literally going on in my life and other people can identify it.
And people don't call boundaries, who we follow on social media. That's a boundary. Ooh. People are what? I'm yeah, boundaries. What am I okay with? What am I not okay with?
Okay, you guys, something that I personally love is personal development. And if you guys love it too, you need to hear this. It's so important because it's something that I believe is an integral part of entrepreneurship and even my life. Last year at the Evoke Retreat, I had the pleasure of taking a session with Courtney Quinn, and I was blown away by her insight. You guys, I still have a note in my notes app from the details of the session, and it's something I refer back to often. She was so fantastic. Through her Coaching with Court program, she takes her clients from where they are to where they want to be, using her signature aligned action method. And you guys, I had the opportunity of working through this aligned action method, and it is phenomenal. Through one-on-one support, Courtney is going to help you get super clear on what you want, how you want to feel, and work with you to get you living a life of health, happiness, and fulfillment. What I love about Courtney's coaching approach is that she understands the importance of integrating your physical and emotional health to really support you in setting and reaching your goals. So if you want support in crushing your goals, finding balance, creating boundaries, and are ready to wake up to a life you love, then we have the coach for you. You're going to want to head to her website, coachingwithcourt, COURT.ca, where you will find all the information to apply to work with Courtney. She currently has limited spots available for her private one-on-one coaching, and you guys do not want to miss out on this opportunity. Not only do you get 2 one-on-one coaching calls each month, you will also have Court in your back pocket for support in between those calls to work through all the kinks that life throws at you. Again, to inquire and apply to work with her, go to her website, coachingwithcourt.ca, or check out her Instagram at coachingwithcourt. You'll also find all these details linked in the show notes.
If I'm not okay with this curated thing or this algorithm that's coming up, I got to follow different people or I got to unfollow different. And that's a boundary, right? The topics we talk with people. Ooh, that's a boundary. What am I okay with and what am I not okay
Yeah.
with? Everybody's doing it every day.
Yeah.
We just call it something different.
Interesting.
And it's really neat to be able, so people in my room, when I'm having conversations, I'm like, I'm just going to stop you there. That's just a boundary. You coming into my room is actually a boundary. And they're like, what the hell are you talking about? It wasn't okay for you to continue, let's say, to feel this way or to have these things continue to happen or this. And they sit there. I'm like, boundaries are what you're okay with and what you're not okay with. You knew that this wasn't okay. You made an action and you showed up. That's a boundary. And they just sit there and just like bewildered.
Well,
you know?
it really reframes what we think boundaries are, because boundaries, think have a negative connotation. I think that's shifting and changing, but for a long time it was like scary
I feel
or
people
bad.
think like ick, sometimes,
certainly.
right? In certain
I
circles.
would say most of the time in
Yeah.
in women,
Yeah.
especially, right? Yeah,
Yeah.
because our worthiness is externalized from the second that we are born. We are taught that our worth and our worth on this world is measured in how much we do for other people, how much we show up for other people, how much we disappoint ourselves and help somebody else. That's what our worthiness is, and we're actually celebrated for it. She's such a selfless mom. Wow. I wish I could do all of those things. You're celebrated. We're celebrated for it.
Yeah.
And so I have conversations now of baby boomers, children of baby boomers, where they're literally, but mom was celebrated so much for this. I don't understand.
Yeah.
Why I'm having such a problem. Why can't I just do all of that? We're put on this pedestal. That's a
And I
whole other
can
conversation on
imagine-
patriarchy and all that stuff.
And like generationally, right?
Yes.
Like how much probably changes between all the different types of generations and things that get passed down, right? And the way that we view boundaries, right? And things are ever changing, ever shifting, which is crazy.
Yeah.
So if someone is feeling, I'm going to use the word ick when they think of boundaries, what is a way, and not that we have to convince anyone, but I'm like, what is a way to sort of start to shift into a healthy perspective and a healthy outlook of maybe being ready to embrace your worthiness and your like what you really want for yourself?
Well, I think the first thing is like embrace the ick. The ick means that you're like, okay, I'm noticing something in my body when I hear the word, let's say boundary. What's actually happening for me, right? Where is that ick sitting, right? And then from there, going, well, where is that ick coming from? Like what stories are attached to some of this ickiness that have contributed to why I feel this way? And so really pulling yourself outside of that and looking at some of these pieces and knowing that I am not the problem. We're so easily, even in our therapy world, traditionally, it's very individualized. You're the problem. If you have a problem with boundaries, just start saying yes. Just start saying no, and that'll just fix it. If that were as easy, we wouldn't be here having this conversation today, right? So it's like understanding that the ick is part of the growth, because you got to be aware of the ick first. And then you got to kind of think about what stories are contributing to this feeling, and knowing that every single one of us has that ick factor. Whether you're doing boundaries for years or just starting it it's always going to be there because of the stories that we carry with us.
Well, and do you think that we start to build confidence in ourselves when we start, like I've heard it said, when you actually start committing to yourself and following through, right? Like you create a boundary, you follow through on it, and you start to build that confidence and that momentum inside of yourself. Would you agree with that?
Absolutely. And it's not even so much, I would say, the outcome. It's actually just the action, because sometimes we can set a boundary. We're like, oh shit, like that didn't work. Okay,
Right.
well, I'm human. I tried. What didn't work here? Okay, you know what? I probably should have maybe picked up the phone and said something rather than send a text message, or, maybe I shouldn't have sent that email that came through right away. Maybe I should have just left myself, a hot minute before I did that. That's me. Like, you got to just put the phone down, simmer down, let that ick factor sort of come back in, and then
Wait a
reset
beat.
and just like center yourself. I've learned from experience.
That's the
sending
best
that
way
email
we
too
learn.
much, right? So it's really just it's understanding that everybody has that, and then looking at what is okay for me and what is not okay for me, and then moving into that space.
I'm curious. I was thinking about, as I was preparing for this episode, I was sitting down with myself and I was thinking, what are my current struggles with boundaries? Like, where am I currently, doing well, and where am I having some friction? So I'm actually kind of curious if you were open and willing to share. What are some current boundaries that you're working on, or some areas that, like realistic, real life, what's going on in your world?
Well, there's always a lot going on in my world. Unfortunately, this is a thing, progress over perfection, right? But since opening up my own private practice, when the emails come through for requests or for questions, really knowing that I don't have to jump on the email back right away. Yeah. And it's not a sign of disrespect for clients that are coming in. It's actually just like 11 o'clock at night, and I finally have a second that I can just sort of chill or watch some Vampire Diaries, because that's what I'm into right now again.
Oh, I watched that twice.
Yeah, it's pretty good. And so, just knowing that I have so one of the things I have done to help with that is to just put an automatic reply in on all of my, so you guys probably would have gotten that when you would have emailed me.
Okay.
That's a boundary.
I'm curious on boundaries and how you coach people on. So obviously you're like, okay, we can like get you to a place to identify the ick, identify the boundary you need, identify maybe the action you're going to take. How do you coach people to then either voice their boundaries, like when they need to voice boundaries, who they need to have conversations with, and then what to do when those people don't respond to boundaries?
Yeah, this is my favorite thing. Okay. Yeah. So this is what I come up with last year. I was like, I need to have some terms around it, because I think one of the pieces of the conversation that we miss is taking a really good assessment about who you need to, the people that you need to hold accountable with the people or peoples that you need to hold accountable. Because sometimes coming up and saying, that's actually not working for me, or I have to say no to something, or this behavior isn't like okay, might not be safe for an individual. Right? So we have to take that assessment first. So that's the first thing. So if somebody's looking, okay, I want to have a boundary with somebody or a set of people, it's like, first thing I would encourage people to think about is take an assessment. Are they safe emotionally for me? Are they safe mentally for me? Are they able to sit in discomfort with me as I bring this up? Have some critical thinking skills? Are they able to hear me? Are they able to sit with their own ick and be able to do the work so we can come back in together? And so with that, there's loud boundaries and quiet boundaries that I like to talk with people. So loud boundaries are something that come actually out of your mouth to people or a set of people, right? And so I always look at a loud boundary is an invitation in. It's an invitation to hear me and my truth, and to understand what's okay for me, what's not okay for me. So it's an invitation in. And what that does, it really strengthens, the intention of that is to really strengthen understanding, whether that's with a partner, a child, a coworker, a family member, an in-law. That's a whole episode.
Yeah, I think it probably is.
But it really that loud piece is an invitation in. So I've done the assessment. Yeah, you know what? I feel like I want to invite sister in. I want to invite aunt in, a cousin and a friend. I'm going to invite them in and just say, hey, leading with love and compassion is really important. I think oftentimes when we think about boundaries, it has to be like this, like hard, assertive, like that's a no, and that can get us, kind of backing into a corner. So leading with love and compassion and being really honest is a loud boundary if you feel like that's helpful for that, and you're not actually putting yourself into like a more dangerous space with an individual, right? So that would be more of a loud boundary. You're inviting somebody in. Now a quiet boundary comes in, and this is through probably a whole year of doing these things and like defining boundaries and being what I was actually recognized as being really rigid. And I remember somebody asking me, because I was talking to a lovely community I've done some great facilitation work with, and they're like, yeah, but what if this person isn't able to receive my boundary? And I sat there, I'm like, what if? You're right. And so, so thankful for people to be brave and to come back and to be like, what if? Because it really shifted things. And so I started thinking about that, doing some more reading, and I'm like, oh yeah, the other person might not be safe, or the people might not be safe for me mentally, physically, maybe even at times, emotionally. So what happens with that? So loud boundaries are outside. Quiet boundaries are more so inside. What do I have to do? So loud boundaries, quiet boundaries. Just take that assessment first. Just take that second to say, is this safe to bring them in? And if the answer is no, just reflect on that a little bit more.
Because how often do we bring a boundary to someone who can't receive that or sit in a healthy space
for
with
their
us?
own reasons?
Yes,
that's right.
That's what I'm reflecting on.
Defensive.
Well, and I think I really like that you said that about the quiet boundaries, because when you were saying like, what do people think when they think of boundaries? And I think my personal observation of boundaries right now in the social media space seems to be, like you said, almost this like, I'm going to tell everybody my boundaries and you better not press up against them. Yeah. And it does come off as quite assertive and sometimes very intimidating, because you're like, well, now I don't know what I can say at all because this person is putting up walls, and you're like...
You just nailed it, though.
Yeah.
That's what it is. That's a wall versus a boundary.
Okay.
I would actually, as you said that, my head went to, who hurt this person?
Yes.
Why are they putting up this protection wall?
Okay. Yeah. So then with that, because we've talked about this before with boundaries, because I think we said on our episode, but like that boundaries can be a little bit fluid, like a little bit like with certain people, or like what you said, like today, this boundary might be a bit bigger and tomorrow it might be a bit closer to my chest right now. Right. And so, but I think I would love that narrative to get out there, that it's like your boundary is a boundary line. It's not a fence. It's not a wall.
Right. Yeah.
Because that's the approach I feel like I'm seeing on social media.
People are building walls.
Yeah. And it's a protection mechanism,
huge.
right? And so those walls, the more that they go sort of unnoticed and sort of under the radar, they get really tall.
Yeah.
It's cold in there. It's lonely. It's really dark inside those walls, but they're protective mechanisms, right? We still have to hold people accountable for behavior, right? But just coming from that place is like, that's a wall. So for me, it's like, okay, what's happening for this individual? You know, why is this wall coming up in such a fashion? But it's being masked as a boundary.
So then, and this kind of goes back to what I said before, because I really want to like get into it, which is, so we've discussed, you know, if you're going to set a boundary, you know, is it a quiet boundary or a loud boundary? You do the assessment, you come out and you say, I can sit with this person. And maybe that wasn't the right call.
Yeah.
And this person comes out of left field and you go, did not anticipate that reaction. What is your advice for those individuals who go, ooh, okay, I'm either way in over my head, or I thought this was safe and now it really isn't. Like, what would you tell them?
Number one, know what your stress response looks like. Ooh. Your body will always tell you what happens. So for me, I get this like creeping red thing. It might actually even happen at the end of this interview, because that's what, like a stress that tells right away. So if you're climbing up, if you're, you know, all these different physiological, your body will always tell you, and your nervous system is geared to detect detect danger or threat.
Yes.
And so your body will tell you. So in those moments, if, you know, we're talking and you come up out of left field and you say something like, I'm just like, oh my gosh, this is not going the way I thought it. Your body is probably going to be moving in. You're like, hey, my body's telling me something. I got to shut this down right now. So you just shut it down. Okay. You know, I need to stop this conversation. This isn't getting us anywhere. I'm noticing some things in myself. I'm noticing some things here. I'm not okay with this. I'm not okay with it. There's a boundary. A boundary and a boundary. I'm not okay with this. We're going to shut this down. So you just leave. Hang up the phone. Stop the FaceTime. Stop the texting. Whatever that looks like for an individual, right? This takes practice. Yeah, but your body will always tell you if you're not feeling it. And then you just shut it down. You shut it down. Yeah. You can still do that respectively. Yeah. But assertively. You know, this isn't feeling okay for me. I'm going to need to leave. Like, the way that this conversation has pivoted is actually not something I'm feeling comfortable with. We're going to put a pin in it, and I'm going to walk away or stop or whatever.
Because how often do we sit, or I'm thinking of myself personally, like just in discomfort for too long and not use your voice, right? And you're like, you can feel it and it's welling up and you're like clamming, like, and
there's no movement there. There's no movement there. There's no growth in that we're just in stress response. So we have to answer that.
And would you advise that those conversations typically happen, because you mentioned texting, and my dad's we had my dad on, and he's a big communicator guy, and anytime I have any conflict, he's like, don't you dare be texting anyone. He's like, you pick up the phone and you call them. Like, that's his advice, which I say to, I think, everybody. I'm like, don't text, like, don't send an email, like, communicate through your voice and even through your face. Like, you know, how you talk to someone is so important when you're going into those conversations. So are you advising people like, hey, if it's safe, like have this conversation in person, have it on the phone or on FaceTime where someone can really feel
Always.
you.
You nailed it though. If it's safe.
Yeah.
If it's safe. And that's a privilege in itself, having the people, safe people around me to be able to take what that is, to take that face to face. For some people, that's not the case. And so, yes, face to face is always, because body language, you know, all of these tone, you can transcend and you can feel that, and it can just work differently. We read things, you know, through our own filters, through our phones or through emails. However, if it's that individual isn't safe, for whatever reason, you know, then those secondary methods can be just as powerful. But yeah, I always would advise somebody pick up the phone, you know, if anything, pick up the phone. But that face-to-face piece is really important, because then you can also feel where they're at, but you can also feel where you're at, right?
Yeah.
It can be really helpful in that way. So yeah, I would say, but it's also just recognizing what's safe for me and what's not safe for me.
Hey friends, it's Erica here. As you may know, my family and I recently sold our house and bought the family farm. And now we're living in constant renovations, and that's just a whole nother story for a different day. When we decided to move, I was not looking forward to walking through the process of selling our home. You can just ask Nick about it. I was dreading it. But then I met Lacey. Lacey Cossette is an award-winning Saskatoon realtor who prides herself in being your one-stop shop for both buying and selling. She is super passionate about helping her clients find their forever home, and honestly, it shows up when you meet her. Lacey was fun, energetic, listened to our needs, and when the time came for negotiations, well, I'm just really happy she was in my corner. With over 12 years in the industry and a 98% list-to-sale ratio, Lacey finds the best individual approach and plan for her clients, including extensive and personalized market strategies. And we all know that is more important now more than ever. Along with her husband and partner, Kyle Berneski, Lacey is licensed in residential, commercial, and farm. So she literally has you covered no matter what real estate area you need. And she has built solid and long-standing relationships within the industry so she can dial up the best lawyers, mortgage brokers, appraisers, contractors, whatever you guys really need. If you want a driven, hardworking, and connected agent who will go above and beyond for you, this is a no-brainer, my friends. Get in touch with Lacey. You can find her at Realty Executive Saskatoon, on socials at Lacey Cossette. That's at LACEYCOSSETTE, and online at laceycossette.com. And don't worry, friends, we will link all of her stuff in the show notes in case you're driving and you can't click right now.
Values that we thought maybe we were unspoken, that we were maybe connected with. And then, you know, once COVID happened, really those values have really shifted, and we're really recognizing, okay, this is actually quite different. And it's really been polarizing and very dividing for a lot of families. So actually what I found is that people will come in around perhaps some of this divide, and the first thing that I name it is like grief. You're in grief.
Yes, absolutely.
You're in grief is what's happening, because we never anticipated that we would ever be at the opposite ends of the table now on some of this stuff. So there's been a lot of certainly like polarization, divide over the last, and I would say that that's probably heightened a lot of these things. And I don't know where I read this from, but they were saying when you have a partner, you are, I don't think they used the word accepting, but you are inviting in all of their unhealedness. Not only them, but their families.
Yes.
And I sat there, I'm like, this is powerful. I've never seen it or like thought about it in that way, but you are accepting. That's what it was. Not you're accepting, not inviting. You're inviting that in. And so you got to be aware of that. And I was like, that's so fascinating.
That was the first thing that came to mind when you said like you're marrying into their family, and in my head, and I was like, and their trauma, like all of everybody's trauma.
Yeah. And the way they you're marrying into a system.
Certainly.
That has been a dynamic. That's a better word. A dynamic that's been established for so long. And now you're coming in. And I mean, my family and my husband's family are, the way we deal with conflict is the polar opposite, right?
And lots of families, you'll find that.
Yeah, it's like the absolute polar opposite. And so, you know, I'm sure he comes to my family and he's like, whoa.
I think it's the same, like, right?
And I go there and I'm like, let's rip up the rug. Let's get into it. Right? So I think, that's a good way to say it. You're like inviting or accepting this dynamic and these these things that have been in place for a really long time.
So how would somebody who's been in a situation that, you know, they've put up with, or behaviors they've allowed to happen for a very long time, how do they then say to that person or start that conversation that says like, okay, so now this is my boundary, when somebody might come back and be like, well, it was fine until now. Like, how do you have that, like that dynamic to me? Like, or you've put up with this behavior for so long, and it's easier to put up with it sometimes than it is to set the boundary, but that's not serving you anymore. How do you navigate that?
Well, one of the things that I always say is use the word anymore. I rarely actually encourage people to use the word actually boundary. Okay. Because that can get people in itself just up.
Yeah.
Back up.
But just what is okay for me, what is not okay for me. So, you know, so-and-so, you know, I just want to have this really vulnerable conversation with you, and I want you to know how hard it is for me to bring this up. But you're important to me. And I want to make sure that what we have here stays this way.
Yeah.
And so this is what I want to say. This, insert whatever it is not okay for me anymore. So what that anymore does, it actually sees and hears what's happening before. So then hopefully that individual can't come back and say, well, we've been commenting on food and weight on the dinner table for 20 some years. Why is it now a problem?
Yeah.
Anymore just sees and hears that right away. So when we're coming at an individual in terms of wanting to share what is okay for me and what is not okay for me, leading with love and compassion first, and reminding them that they're important to you. Because if they weren't important to you, you wouldn't be sitting down and having this conversation. We don't got to sit down and be like, Erica, no more. Right? We can be like, you're important to me.
Yeah.
And because you're important to me, I really feel like I have to share this for you, but it's really hard for me.
Yeah.
Well, and then with people who set boundaries, because I feel, and maybe you're not going to agree with this, but I'm like, I would feel my responsibility of understanding that if I'm the one setting the boundary, I need to understand that there might be a shift, and there might be, you know, like owning up to, I'm changing the name of the game here. Yeah. And if the game for 20 years has been, let's comment on weight and food at the dinner table, that yes, while it's not appropriate, and, you know, I've been actually an active participant in this, I need to now say, I recognize and we talk about this sometimes, I'll go, I'm the one changing the game.
Yeah.
So now, while the game needs to change because it needs to be better for me in this situation, I think having compassion to understand there's going to be uncomfortability there.
Oh, and if there's not, then I would say that we're not doing it right.
Or even resistance. And I think that's where the one thing with boundaries that I'm seeing on social media is like, this is my boundary, and like, everyone
adhere
to it, and everyone just better be okay with it. And if there's any signs of like, hey, can I meet you to talk about possibly, it feels like a toss them out.
Right.
Like, I don't want to.
Right.
Nope.
Well, I think sometimes you see people set boundaries, and then the expectation is like, I've set the boundary, so now the work is on you.
Right. Ooh, interesting.
Right?
That's a good point.
Like, I've done the work of setting the boundary and communicated it. Like, now it's your responsibility.
And this is why I love having this idea of boundaries as invitations in. Because it takes people to be able to form that together.
Yes.
Right? It's like invitations in. Right? So we all have a responsibility here. If I'm hearing from somebody that this is not okay for me anymore, if I can lean into that discomfort and say, right, okay, that is actually not okay anymore. Like what I did was not okay. And I have been called out on my yeses. And it's like, Ash, now you're strung out. Now you can't do this, or you can't show up to this, you know, or you've neglected this. And I sit back and I'm like, oh yeah, that's me. Somebody just called me in to say that's not okay. It's now my responsibility to come back because they're important to me. Right. And so, yeah, I guess we're kind of meshing into all three of the conversations, but that's what it is. It's like it's an invitation in when it feels okay. Right. And sometimes it has to be a little bit more stern if that other individuals or set of individuals that cannot be invited in for whatever reason.
I really love that you just said they called me in instead of they called me out.
Yeah.
That really just shifts it right there.
does, because it's like we don't have to come at boundaries with like on the horse with the stick on fire and just like go to war.
Yeah.
You know, like
Well, and that's, I think, what I'm trying to express has been my experience. Is I'm almost like, you almost feel corralled by boundaries sometimes. And you're like, okay, well, now I'm just going to kind of like tiptoe over here because I don't really know what's allowed, because the boundary has even been like, don't bring it up. And you're like, okay.
Yeah.
Great. And again, that's me needing to learn how to respond to boundaries as well. But my question just flew right out of my... I have it. Actionable steps. So when you sit down with someone and you're like, hey, so we've established safe person, you can have this conversation. Are you now coaching people through like, and now when your boundary is, I don't know if we want to say like crossed, you know,
pushed,
someone is like, you know, getting their toe over that line a little bit. Yep. Are you coaching through like some very real actionable steps? And this is something my dad has always talked to me about, is like, prepare what you're going to say. And I'm quite like, is that something you're working through with people as well?
I think it's recognizing in the therapy room, like what people are able to do and what they're not able to do and what feels okay for them. So if somebody's like that, tipping the line a little bit, right? Being able to, again, call them in. I'm just noticing, you know, like I put this out there, mom, I put this out here, mom, you know, can we talk about this, you know, and bring it into conversation, that way. But remembering that boundaries are not about dictating the behaviors of other people. That's a lot of the therapy room. That's what comes into my room a lot. And so we have tons of conversation, because I think a lot of us think that boundaries are about controlling. Just stop doing this. You need to stop saying this. You need to stop, you know, not doing this, doing all these things. Stop. Nobody wants to be told what to do.
Very
more
true.
So than a 4-year-old.
Yeah. Or a 6-year-old.
Or a 45-year-old or an 80-year-old or everybody in between and outside of that. At the end of the day, nobody wants to be told what to do. So we rein that back. Boundaries are not about controlling the behaviors of others, but it is about keeping ourselves accountable of what we are going to do if that boundary continues to be towed over and violated.
Yeah.
What am I going to do? So, Uncle so-and-so, you know, I've already shared to you that's really not okay for you to comment on my food. I've already shared with you that that's not okay. If this continues, I'm going to actually get up out of the table. I'm going to leave.
Yeah.
That's not okay for me anymore. Or I'm going to leave the house. Or actually, you and I actually can't sit down at the dinner table anymore. You know, I'm okay with maybe we have a conversation on the couch or, you know, outside or around the campfire, but like you and me at the dinner table aren't going to work anymore. Right? So boundaries are not about dictating the behaviors of others, but really coming to understand, what am I going to do when this continues to happen? Because you are not focusing on what they're going to do. You're reining it in, going, what am I going to do? Some people will then come be like, wow, that sounds like a threat. That sounds like, I'm like, that's what they want us to say, because that will just keep us quiet.
Well, and what just came to mind too is that, like, as you were speaking that and saying, okay, if that doesn't work this doesn't work for me anymore. If this continues, I'm going to get up and leave the dinner table. And I think the mom in me was like, you better get up and leave the dinner table then if it doesn't, like, right? Because there has to be that actionable, right? So what would you say to somebody who has problem with the follow through?
Yeah, I mean, that's not something that's the follow through is the hardest part, I would say, the follow through, right? Because that needs us to go further into our own steps. We have to go into ourselves more to say, I actually might have to get up off the dinner table when there's 10 other people that have been putting up with this shit for so long, and now I have to leave.
Yeah.
Oh my goodness.
Yeah.
Right? Or whatever. Maybe and a lot of conversation. So I guess it would have been this time last year around holiday time, right? Like if I can't go, maybe I just can't go. I did a whole series of like holiday boundaries around Christmas.
Oh yeah, I imagine.
And it was like really interesting, the conversations that we're having. It was like, okay, it's one thing for me to say, well, if this doesn't happen, I can't go, but then I actually can't go.
Yeah. And being okay with it. I remember a few years ago, my dad was, and I quote my dad so much, but
he's very quotable.
He was talking with me about some boundaries and helping me set one with someone that I needed to set one. And I remember he kind of laid out, you know, safe, actionable. He's like, these are all the things. And I was like, well, what if I don't want to like deal with this. I'm just not going to go. I'm just not going to go. And he was like, you know, he's like, have your actionable steps in place, But he said, but sometimes you have to allow someone the opportunity to change.
Yeah.
And he was like, if you just are like, I'm never going again, then they may have heard you, but now you're never giving them the opportunity to like actually
to meet your dad.
You'll hear his episode.
Yeah.
Respect that boundary, because now you've just almost written off. And he's like, but then you have your actionable step that says, hey, this is what I'm going to do if this continues. And if it continues, he was like, you do it, you get up, you leave. Like, you have to do it, but you've given them a chance.
Yeah.
And he's like, if you always have your out,
Yeah.
right, you can show up to the gathering that you want to go to.
And that's exactly it. You're inviting them in, but you're not responsible whether or not that they come in.
Yeah.
So
and now you're not just the person that they're like, oh, they don't come around anymore.
right.
Well, no, you're like, I'm going to show up. I'm going to let you know that if you cross this boundary, I am going to leave. So if you want me to stay, let's just have a great night.
Yeah.
And it's, but it's those follow through that I think sometimes, I don't know if you can like teach it or coach it. And it's like, you got to like dig deep and have that follow through.
You just got to do it. So my favorite definition of courage from Dr. Jody Carrington is like doing, doing something without knowing what the outcome's going to be. So, calling that person in saying, this is not okay for me. And I've already shared this with you. And it's continuing. So I'm going to, like, the next family, mom, the next family thing or whatever it is, I'm going to step out on this one. I can't do that. That's courage. And so sometimes you're never going to feel like wake up in the morning and be like, I just feel like setting a really strong boundary today. Nobody's going to wake up. That's confidence. You just got to, sometimes you just got to call in and then you just got to do it.
Well, and I imagine like visualization would help as well for the follow through.
Any type of prep, absolutely.
Right.
And having a really solid support.
Yeah.
To hold you in the grief. Because that's what it is.
Yes.
If you have to then make a decision with the follow through, that's grief. That's all that is.
Absolutely.
So you got to have somebody help you hold you through that, whether that's a partner, a loved one, an animal, your favorite podcast, your favorite show, a therapist, a faith leader, a cultural leader, whatever that looks like. You got to have somebody help you hold that grief, because that can be really heavy. Because you're also feeling there's disappointment and frustration and confusion. Your worth is now so much hurt and pain. And that's grief.
Yeah, absolutely.
You're going to find somebody to help hold it.
How do you navigate when somebody has severely overstepped a boundary and does not understand or will not take any accountability for it?
That's when quiet boundaries come into place. Yeah.
I really like that quiet boundary thing because I think I reflect, and if you've listened to our episode, I'm like, I don't know, boundaries. Like, I think the picture of it being a line instead of a wall is very good for me, because I think I'm quite an open individual. Yeah. So for me, I'm like, anyone can kind of come over here. I'm like, but I'll kind of put you back over the line if I need to.
Certainly.
Right. And so I like that openness, but I think the quiet boundary is good for me. Which is funny because I'm so vocal and so loud, but that's probably like a coping mechanism that I'm like,
is that a trauma response?
It's better for me to just be like, I know what I need to do, and I know how to keep myself safe in an unsafe environment, which is really good, because I think my go-to would be like, I have to communicate this boundary. Otherwise it's not going to work.
That's the pressure.
Yeah, that's
and that
absolutely.
That pressure in itself really keeps people underneath and away from speaking their truth.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I feel like people are going to go bananas over this.
Yes.
In a good way.
Good.
She's like,
super vulnerable to come out and do something like this. You just never know, right?
No, and we appreciate you so much. And as you were speaking, in my head, I'm like, there's going to be so many good quotes from this episode.
Which shout them out and tag us. Tag both of us and shout us out with your favorite insights of the account.
Thank you.
I have a feeling we're going to have a lot of great conversations in the DMs from this. So for those of you, or for those of our listeners who don't know where to find you, can you please share where they can find you on socials and how they can work with you?
Sure. So I'm Ashley Ashley _ the boundary therapist on Instagram, and my private practice is Breland Counseling here in Saskatoon. Amazing. And so I'm always accepting new clients. I can work with anybody that's living within Saskatchewan. And
we have one final question that we want to ask you. What is the best advice you've ever received?
Oh, you can have everything you want. You just can't have everything on the same day.
Ooh, I like that.
You can have anything you want. You can have everything you want. You just can't have everything on the same day.
I love that.
Yeah, that's good.
Amazing.
Thank you.
You want to know who it's from?
Yeah.
Yes.
Dr.
Shock
Seuss.
all you all. Lisa Craig.
Oh, that's cute. I thought you were going to be like Winnie the Pooh or something.
Yeah.
Which, if you guys haven't listened to that episode, you should go back and listen to it. 'cause we've
Absolutely.
been lucky and
gosh.
fortunate enough to have her on the podcast as well.
Yeah.
And that was a killer.
That was a kicker. Thank you, Ashley, so much.
Thank you for
Thank
trusting
you.
me with your space. Hopefully this was helpful for somebody.
Yes,
Such a
it was
pleasure.
great.
Thank you, everyone, for joining us on this episode of the Her Podcast. If you want to follow along with us, you can find us on Instagram and TikTok at its.her.podcast. We can't wait to see you there.
Bye.
Adios.